At Wat Tham Klong Phen. After the rains retreat, Vasa, ended, I returned to Wat Tham Klong Phen. The plan was, if Luang Por Khao Analayo were to ask about the results of my practice of mental cultivation, Bhavana Patipati, I would tell him about it. But if he didn't ask, I would not have to say anything. Or, if another teacher, Acariya, asked about the results of my practice, I would first have to consider which teachers I should tell or should not tell. It isn't that anyone who asks will be told. Staying at Wat Tham Klong Phen, however foolishly I had acted before, that was how foolishly I would act on my return. I arrived at Wat Tham Klong Phen when it was dark, around 8 p.m., so I didn't go to pay my respects to Luang Por at his hut, Kuti. I spent the night at the temple. The following morning, Luang Por came to the pavilion in order to depart for alms, Bindabata, at a Chee's home. I went to bow to Luang Por at that time. I hadn't even finished bowing when Luang Por asked me straight away, "How are you, Thoon? What was the outcome of your practice? Tell me about it." It wasn't the appropriate time and there were many elder Thera monks sitting there, so I told Luang Por, "With permission, Luang Por, this evening I will go to your kuti and tell you about it." Luang Por nodded and left for alms at the Machi's home. In the evening, after all the monks and samaneras had cleared out of Luang Por's kuti, I had the opportunity to be alone with him. I asked Luang Por for permission and told him about the fruits, pala, of my practice, patipati. After telling Luang Por about it, he remarked, "Very few people are capable of experiencing this kind of fruit of practice." He said, "I have also experienced the same thing. When it comes to fruits of practice that are real and genuine, you needn't say much, just a few sentences and you instantly know the entire significance. These days, those who will know the fruits of practice like this are few in number." Luang Por asked, "How long had you been ordained before coming to reap the fruits of practice?" "With permission, Luang Por, I had been ordained 8 days shy of 8 years when I reaped the fruits of practice." Luang Por grinned and said, "It's probably due to old perfections of character, bharami. Having cultivated so much in past lives, they have become the causes and conditions, pachaya, for your attainment being this quick." Luang Por asked, "Before wisdom, panya, arose, what was the metaphor, ubaya, used for contemplating?" I asked Luang Por for permission and told him about the causes and conditions that led to wisdom arising, and recounted the skunk vine story. What I related about the skunk vine is entirely identical to what I have previously described. I explained how I use wisdom to contemplate, and how I use the metaphor to draw parallels to defilements, kilesa, and desires, tanha. When I finished, Luang Por grinned and said, "The cause, conditions, and metaphor that you have described resemble mine. The only discrepancy is the difference in object. The use of wisdom to contemplate, as you have described it, is entirely like mine." I took the opportunity to ask Luang Por, "With permission, Luang Por, what causes and conditions precipitated the emergence of your wisdom metaphor?" Then, Luang Por proceeded to tell me about what happened decades ago. He described it in detail and sequentially, as if it were an experience that had taken place only 2 to 3 days ago. The events that Luang Por spoke of were very sharp in his memory. He related the incidents that had caused wisdom to arise. One afternoon, I went to bathe in the river below a hillside. It was during a time when people were harvesting rice. When I looked at the rice fields, I saw yellow grains of mature rice everywhere. At that time, I hadn't bathed yet, so I sat down. I watched the rice as it was being harvested, and the thought emerged in my mind. The rice that they are harvesting comes from grains of rice from last year, because grains of rice contain the germ that leads to rebirth. Once someone takes a grain of rice which contains this germ and sows it into the dirt that is moist from the water, the germ that exists in the grain of rice will begin to break out and sprout from that grain of rice. Initially, the germ is a small white dot. It sends roots into the ground and extracts fertilizer from the ground for sustenance. From a grain of rice, it grows into a small plant. Many days later, the rice plant grows more beautiful, like a straw plant. After roughly 1 month, it is uprooted and replanted in the dirt. The rice plant matures and grows larger. Once it reaches full maturity, there emerge ears of young grains of rice with soft hulls. Then, the rice grains with soft hulls mature into rice inside of the hulls. and the rice germ is contained in the tip of the grain of rice within the hull. Then, the farmers collect the rice that contains the germ to use in propagation. The grain of rice is then regenerated. It generates grains of rice just like the grains before. Luang Por explained further. When a grain of rice that contains the germ falls into moist soil, it will grow into a plant and into grains of rice once more. But if you remove the hull and use your fingernail to remove the germ from the tip of the grain of rice, and take that remaining grain of rice and sow it into soil moist with water and fertilizer, that grain of rice will not regenerate into a plant at all. Or if you take that grain of rice with its hull and cook it over a fire so that it burns, and then you sow it into the soil, it also will not regenerate. This is because the germ within the grain of rice has been destroyed. Gone are the causes, and gone are the conditions to be reborn again. Once I finished contemplating the grains of rice, I internalized opanayiko, the grains of rice, drawing parallels inward to my body and inward to my mind. Then I used wisdom to contemplate further. The entire rice plant was like my body. The grains of rice were like my mind. The germ in the tip of the grain of rice was like defilements and desires. Using a fingernail to break off the germ contained in the grain of rice is like using mindfulness, sati, and wisdom, paññā, to contemplate and eradicate various defilements, desires, and mental intoxications, asava, from the mind. Once the mind no longer has defilements and desires as the fuel leading to rebirth, from where would existences, bhava, and rebirths, chati, come? Once there are no more existences or rebirth, then how would there be any more aging, sickness, death, suffering, distress, sadness, grief, or shame? Thus, the issues of the mind and issues of defilements and desires attaching themselves to the mind are important issues that must be fixed. They must be eradicated from the mind within this lifetime in order to prevent the protraction of your rebirths, bhavachati, as you continue to be reborn in various existences. Readers, the period in which Luang Por Khao used wisdom to contemplate the grains of rice was when insight knowledge, vipassana jnana, arose. On the surface, it seems that at the time he was using thoughts to contemplate in an ordinary fashion, that was not any different from the thoughts and contemplations of typical practitioners. But there was one thing that was not the same, namely the strength of his mind, the strength of his mindfulness, the strength of his wisdom, and the strength of his perfections of character, bharami, that had come together perfectly. All of the bharami that had been cultivated in the past, and the bharami that Luang Por had practiced in the present rebirth, the 5 spiritual faculties, indriya, that were fully mature and courageous, as well as the strength of all of the other efforts that Luang Por had cultivated, had all come together perfectly. Consequently, vipassana jnana arose at that moment. The strength of vipassana jnana then executed every last defilement, desire, and mental intoxication so that none remained in the mind. It was what extinguished the fuel, or desire, tanha, that leads to rebirth in various existences, bhava. It is this strength of vipassana jnana that is the prominent attribute that enables a practitioner's attainment of enlightenment as an arahant in this lifetime. May you all understand this. You should adopt this as a model to some extent. After that, I took a bath in the river. While I was bathing, I contemplated the filthiness in every part of the body. It was as if I were washing a corpse in the water. Seeing as the body is dirty, it must be washed with water. Seeing as the mind is dirty with defilements and desires, it must be washed with mindfulness and wisdom. With strong mindfulness and wisdom, defilements and desires will easily detach and fall from the mind. Mindfulness and wisdom are the detergent that directly washes the mind clean of defilements and desires. Wherever the fuel for rebirth is buried in the mind, there wisdom scrubs so that the dirtiness of defilements and desires can no longer bind to or cling to the mind. Even though defilements and desires have been bound to the mind for a long time, with strong mindfulness and wisdom, eradicating desires and mental intoxications from the mind is a task easily accomplished. After I finished bathing, I scooped water into a bamboo flask and carried it back to my kuti straight away. The walk back was essentially a means, ubaya, of walking meditation, jankama. When I arrived at the kuti, I put the bamboo flask inside and came out to continue walking meditation. I used wisdom to contemplate in a continuous manner. I contemplated with wisdom in the same manner, ubaya, I had contemplated the grains of rice, in order to teach the mind at all times. The contemplations were supported with reason in a manner that corresponded to principles of reality, and in a manner such that the mind knew and saw the suffering, dukkha, harmful consequences, dosa, and perils, paya, of rebirth, chati, namely, birth, aging, sickness, and death, and that nothing is self or self-belongings, at all times. The vipassana jnana that arose was incredibly courageous, resolute, and steadfast, and it did not permit defilements and desires to establish themselves whatsoever. Whatever it was that I contemplated, I would know and see the entirety of it according to reality, until comprehensive clarity arose in the mind, citta, and all doubts about it vanished. The methods, ubaya, used in those contemplations were the same as what you had described, Venerable Thoon. When it got dark, I went into my kuti and settled down to contemplate further. Luang Por recounted, after a short time of using wisdom to contemplate, the citta needed calmness. I directed the citta into a fully calm state. Luang Por explained, in the many years since I began to practice, this was my first time experiencing the citta being calm. Previously, the citta had experienced a measure of calm, but it was like a flash of lightning. A mere split second later, the citta would retreat, and I would use wisdom to contemplate universal truths, such as Dhamma, thereafter. But this time, the citta was in a very steadfast state of calmness. Luang Por said, I recalled Luang Por Man's teaching. Venerable Cow, if the citta's calmness reaches the basis of consciousness, citta satiti, do not force the citta to withdraw itself. Let the citta remain in that calmness. Once the citta is replete from meditation, samadhi, it will withdraw on its own. Do not allow the citta to completely withdraw, however. Be mindful to focus the citta a bit. Then use wisdom to contemplate on universal truths thereafter. Then I effectively practiced according to Luang Por Man's teachings. Luang Por Khao said, the meditative calm transpired according to everything Luang Por Man had said. Once the citta began to withdraw from the calmness, I was mindful to focus the citta slightly, and use wisdom to contemplate the grain of rice metaphor thereafter. I internalized the metaphor, reflecting inward to my body and reflecting inward to my mind, until there arose clear knowledge and realization of the defilements and desires that were rooted in my mind. Then there arose in my mind the knowledge and realization of the suffering, harmful consequences, and perils that the mind experiences because of defilements and desires.